am a clinical psychologist, and my specialty is in the field of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. I spend my days listening to people's stories about the horrors they have experienced and attempt to support them in their efforts to recover from these events. I'm often asked by people how I can do this work, the prevailing assumption tending to be that the work of listening to trauma would in itself be traumatic. I no doubt started from this position about 15 years ago when I started work in this realm. My first job in the industry involved working with teenage girls who were involved in the sex trade in some way. And I entered this position expecting to be horrified by the work and the stories I would hear. The reality is that I often was, and stunned by the atrocities I would hear that had been committed. But that wasn't the preeminent impression that formed during my tenure at the organization, and it hasn't been what stayed with me through the years as I've developed my skill in this field. What struck me most then, that has endured, is the drive to not only survive, but thrive I have witnessed in the clients with whom I worked. My expectation was that the clientele with whom I worked would have been damaged beyond repair and broken by the experiences they had endured in their young lives. That this wasn't the case gave me pause, and my reflections on why this expectation was not met has influenced my work and reflections in this area ever since, and continues in the work I do today. My job these days has me working in government healthcare with soldiers, veterans, and RCMP officers who have been exposed to traumatic events secondary to their service. The clients who visit our clinic range in age, from young soldiers who have recently deployed and returned from Afghanistan, to elderly folks who served in Korea and World War II, not to mention the RCMP officers who have served and protected this country from sea to sea. I also spend time in a private setting seeing civilians who have experienced a range of troubling and traumatic events. And I hope to share with you today some of the things I've learned in this work, having come to understand certain significant things about human nature and the human experience in helping those to whom the unthinkable has happened. So I'll start today by discussing the nature of trauma and its effects. One of the things I wrestled with in creating this talk was how much to emphasize one aspect of my work over another. And in the debate I had with myself, I decided to focus on that which is relevant to the collective, rather than potentially to a more narrow subgroup. And my decision to do so was motivated by an important piece of knowledge I have gathered in this work, and that is that trauma is a great equalizer. It cuts across socioeconomic strata. It doesn't care about gender or ethnicity, religion or class. No one is immune to the possibility of experiencing something horrific or shattering. And while that is potentially a sobering thought, I think awareness of this fact can be liberating if one can allow oneself to accept it and its significance. And I'll speak more to that point in just a moment. Before doing so, I'd like to briefly outline some of the things I've learned about trauma and its effects, and we'll begin to do so by describing a scene to you to set the stage for the ideas I'd like to convey. So imagine, if you will, a father. He's middle-aged, of middle income, and like many fathers living in the world today, he has to work away from his family for stretches of time as he makes more money working in remote communities than he could in the town in which they live. The particular camp in which he stays while working away has an on-site fitness facility, and so on this particular Saturday afternoon, he is just stepping outside to return to his room after finishing a workout. And he begins to notice that the people he passes are giving him what he perceives are strange looks. Initially he brushes this off, admonishing himself for being paranoid. And then he hears his name called over the camp paging system with a request that he present to the administration office. His heart begins to race. He begins to sweat. A feeling of dread begins to overtake him. He cannot explain why this reaction is occurring. He only knows that he believes something awful is about to happen. And it turns out he was right. On presenting to the administration office, he is informed by the supervisor on duty that there has been an accident. His wife and children were on a road trip north to visit family, and their vehicle was struck. His wife and youngest two children survived, and his eldest did not. trauma has the effect of organizing the lives of trauma survivors into life pre-trauma and life post-trauma. Life post-trauma involves knowing things that perhaps before were not known at all, or only minimally known or acknowledged. Life post-trauma means having come into contact with the knowledge of certain things, like mortality, that once having contacted or experienced can no longer be ignored or denied. The experience I just described was equivalent to a tectonic shift for the individual to whom it occurred. If the car crash hadn't occurred, that Saturday afternoon would have faded into irrelevancy with all of the other Saturday afternoons that had come before. In the face of having had this accident and having to contend with the devastation that occurred, life for this person was reorganized into life before that Saturday afternoon and everything that has occurred since. And what commonly begins to happen to people, if left to recover from this type of event on their own, is that they understandably try to create distance between themselves and the experience of the events. To experience something like I described is to come into contact with unparalleled psychological and emotional pain. And much like pulling away from a burner on the stove, the impulse is to get away from that source of the pain. Unfortunately, however, separating ourselves from our internal experience is not as cut and dried as pulling away from a burner on the stove. And what starts to happen to people as they attempt to divorce themselves from emotional pain is profound alienation from themselves, their thoughts and feelings, and from others. And predictably, when self and other alienation occurs, symptoms develop. Mood states shift, pervasive avoidance develops, and quality of life plummets. Emotional numbing occurs. Human beings are intrinsically social creatures, and being deprived of emotional contact and connection with self and other is life-threatening. And it's important to note the viciousness of this cycle. The urge to pull away and avoid is typically driven by the enormity of pain experienced by the individual who has been traumatized. And the pulling away is usually employed to prevent further pain from occurring. But the process of becoming estranged from oneself and from others actually creates more of the pain and disillusionment that was being avoided in the first place. And on the cycle continues. And to speak to this point in a slightly different way, trauma, like that which can occur on a field of battle or the experience of a sexual assault or violent crime, fundamentally involves disconnection. What people are forced to wrestle with in the aftermath of a traumatic event is how to reconstruct a life and a worldview when what used to be there has been shattered. Following trauma, the ability to take for granted what was once so easily assumed is usually lost. One of the most critical assumptions that is often lost is around control. And when people develop post-traumatic stress disorder following exposure to trauma, there will inevitably be dysfunctional attempts to reassert a sense of control, which in reality perpetuates the problem. In my work, by the time people present for treatment, there is typically profound disconnection and withdrawal that has occurred. It is typically the norm that in an attempt to manage the painful thoughts and feelings that are left in the wake of a traumatic event, people will have narrowed the range of their existence. This frequently means that people rarely leave the house. They will have often lost contact with friends and sometimes even all of their family members. The thinking being, if I control my world in this way, I will be physically and emotionally safe. What happens, though, is that the outside world takes on a property of being extremely dangerous and out of control. And this fosters additional disconnection and retreat, further strengthening that pattern of pain and alienation I mentioned a moment ago. The message I'd like you to take away from what I've just presented is that the urge to pull away from pain is instinctual and is what is referred to as a normal reaction to abnormal events. And in understanding what is normative or predictable following trauma, the stage is set to explore what becomes necessary in the process of recovery. As far as I've observed, the antidote to the struggle I've described rests with re-engagement. My work with people involves helping them to begin to take steps to re-engage with themselves and the internal world of thoughts and feelings, and with those around them. And it is in this process of re-engagement that healing starts to occur. And just a note or two on how I've seen this recovery occur. What I've experienced in my work is that there is incredible curative power in our relationships and in our ability to attach and connect with each other. The impact of relationships on healing has been researched extensively, and my anecdotal experience has been supported in research studies time and again. What this means is that in examining how it is that people get better, it is not the application of any one specific technique that seems to make the difference. Rather, healing happens in the context of a connection with another human being, when qualities of safety, empathy, and genuine understanding are present. In fact, therapy will not be successful, regardless of the expertise of the clinician in delivering any one intervention, if the therapeutic relationship is not present. So what the evidence suggests then is that people can endure and recover from the most horrific of experiences, provided they have even one person whom they can attach to and connect with on an emotional level. And while crucially important to the world of therapy, this remains a life lesson to me and a guiding principle about how I believe we should walk through life. The capacity for people to endure and remain resilient to the most horrific experiences, like torture or violent assault, or the grief of losing a child, is mitigated by the human connections they have at the time of such events and in their aftermath. So how does this all relate to the theme of today's event, and how does this apply to communities at large and the individuals living in them? I have a few takeaway lessons I've gleaned from my work I keep on hand I'd like to now share with you in the hopes that they resonate. One of these is that depending on the circumstances, anyone is capable of anything. I think this is a crucial piece of knowledge to hold if there is true intention to engage empathically with our fellows. It is easy to cast off those who experience or perpetrate horrific things as being unlike us or different in some way. And my worry is that if we operate from that standpoint, we will always be operating from a place of disconnection and isolation. Empathy entails putting oneself in the shoes of another. And I think it's important that we all challenge ourselves to cultivate this ability, as given the right circumstances or the right conditions, we are all capable of anything. A second takeaway lesson is the importance of struggle and pain to the development of character. I often describe the process of recovery I observe in my clients as transformational and equivalent in many ways to the evolution of caterpillar into butterfly. It is the struggle to re-emerge that is crucial in the process of transformation. Without the struggle, the new entity will not appear. And this highlights to me the importance of struggle and difficulty in the development of character, and how oftentimes something more meaningful and potentially beautiful can be obtained if achieving it involves challenge and struggle. I believe there's a great cost to the character of human beings if things are achieved too easily. And to carry this point out somewhat further, I think it's important for individuals and communities to continually examine the beliefs that are collectively held. In the last century, Western cultures appear to have more and more adopted what has been referred to as the happiness myth. The idea inherent in this myth is that if we are not happy all the time, something is wrong. And if this is the belief, you can imagine the terrible dilemma faced by anyone who goes through a difficult time or who endures a traumatic event. The message inherent in this is that if you are not happy, there is something wrong with you. And if we accept this belief or myth out of hand without examining its implications, we are at significant risk of fostering the self and other alienation I referred to a moment ago. The belief that happiness or satisfaction must always be present, and if it is not, that says something negative about ourselves, will encourage us to deny or avoid any internal experience that runs counter. And this places individuals and communities at much greater risk for suffering if and when a traumatic event comes along. My wish is that on individual and community levels, we would all strive more and more for whole integration, such that our ability to experience fear or sadness or uncertainty can be welcomed as much as our ability to experience happiness, pride, or satisfaction. If, on a day-to-day basis, we as individuals and as members participating in our communities are better able to operate from a position where all experience is valued, I think we'll be healthier and better able to address the challenges in our lives from a place of being willing and able to have and experience whatever those challenges should entail. I'll leave you with one of the most difficult lessons I've taken away from my work thus far, and that is, we do not have control over everything. Bad things do happen to good people, and there's lots in our that happens in our societies that isn't fair. And it's a challenge sometimes to have to hold that knowledge and choose to participate in this world all the same. But, as I presented, the cost of avoiding or denying this fact is too high, in my opinion, for the potential such denial can have on our connections to ourselves and to each other. Thank you very much for letting me speak to you today.